I can try to answer that question, but I'd also have to be honest that the BDSM context that I know is the Indian context, and I actually do not know that much about other contexts, but to the limited extent that I've read and that I've met people from other countries. One thing I want to say is that yes, it is definitely influenced not just by culture but also by social and economic issues and contexts. So my sense is that in countries of the north, richer countries, that BDSM, that there's a danger of BDSM being extremely commercial, in the sense that there is a high premium placed on toys that are expensive. There are many workshops that are conducted, which is great, offering very specialized sort of skill building, but these can also be quite expensive workshops. And I quite like the fact that in the Indian context we are still a young community, so there isn't that kind of pressure to buy fetish wear. I mean, I don't think you can even buy it. Maybe you can buy, some people buy it online, but we don't have that kind of commercialization here as yet. And there's still a lot of imagination in terms of how somebody might want to dress up during a session or during a play party. There isn't that thing of a uniform, maybe I like to wear like a Kerala mund, like a lungi in a particular way, which I think is a kinky way, and I don't have to go out and buy latex. And anyway, one would die in latex in India for the most part, in the heat and the humidity, or at least in certain parts of India. And so I think that's one difference. I think that also in terms of say caste and class, I think that in any case, the community in India is largely an online community, and who has access to online spaces? You have to be of a certain class background. It is mostly English speaking people. So we have that kind of disadvantage. In other countries where the language in which they interact in the online community is the language that's maybe spoken throughout that country and across classes. But in India we have that colonial kind of heritage of then the English speaking also being the more elite class. And then of course class and caste go hand in hand, so there is also that kind of hierarchy and inbuilt discrimination in the BDSM community in India. I think that, in the Kinky collective, we have a very strong critique of 50 Shades of Grey, and we've also written about it. It's available online, and it is very dangerous, perpetuating those kinds of myths, the way that Christian Grey was portrayed. And because he this is very offensively written, that he had a crack whore as a mother, and that because he experienced abuse as a child, that's why he was a sadist, and these kind of dangerous kind of misconceptions, which we've also faced in the LGBT community. She must have had a bad experience as a child, that's why she hates men and she is attracted to women. So we know that these are ways in which mainstream society tries to deal with what they find different and which threatens them, so then they're always trying to give some sort of an explanation, which is of course very faulty. But the good thing, as you were saying about 50 Shades of Grey, is that it has really reached out to millions of people, and we are also grateful for that kind of thing. And once it's out in the open, at least one can talk about it. At least then there can be conversations about it. And like in Delhi, not recently, but maybe 3 years ago at the Akshara Theatre, there was a reading of 50 Shades of Grey, and then some of us from the Kinky collective went for that performance, and it was really good because after the performance there was a discussion and we could put forward our point of view. We also spoke about the BDSM community, and in fact one of the members of Kinky Collective actually joined us because we met at that event. So literally it was spreading the word in that sort of way. But I also have to add that we've actually had excellent media coverage by journalists, who we have interacted with as the Kinky Collective. And of course, these are selected, trusted journalists. We kind of look at their writings, and we kind of make sure that they will take our inputs in what they write, in the sense that if there's something that we find has misrepresented BDSM, then we will ask for that to be removed. So we negotiate, as we do in BDSM, even with journalists. But we have had excellent coverage of BDSM issues, and that is in terms of mainstream media, newspapers and magazines. And then of course there's the wonder of Facebook and Twitter, and that is really remarkable, where we can actually control the kind of content that goes out. The Kinky Collective is still quite a new group, so there's not that much of a history as such to speak of. But definitely, right from the beginning, we have reached out to the women's movement as well as queer groups, and it's taken different forms. It's been small informal meetings in our homes, where we've had discussions. It's been presenting papers at the Indian Association of Women's Studies conferences. So it's also had that formal kind of paper presentation and discussion kind of format. And also we've had workshops in which we've specifically invited people from the women's movement and from LGBT groups, also individuals. And it's actually been very, very rich, the discussions. Not just rich, actually, there's a sense of camaraderie. Especially with LGBT individuals, I think there is a connect, both because of the similarity in the problems, in the challenges, in the stigma, in the silencing. Although now it's very interesting that in the BDSM community, people actually look up to the LGBT community, that they are up there and we are down here, So LGBT is actually seen as being very respectable. They can at least fight with the state, for their rights, and, engage in the realm of the law, which, the BDSM community cannot even imagine doing. So actually, when you're in the LGBT community, you think you're at the bottom of the ladder, And then then for me, because I moved from the LGBT community to the BDSM community, it was very, interesting for me to see that. But at the same time, there is a lot of richness in that conversation, not just around common forms of marginalization, but also the kind of challenge that we pose to the idea of the normal and the natural. Because the LGBT community does that, and so do we. And which is why many of us feel that kinky is queer. Because if by queer we are using a broader definition, not just of LGBT, but queer as being something that challenges existing power relations, challenges existing ideas of what is normal and natural, then kinky is definitely queer. So, and the difference is that in LGBT it's about who you desire, in kink it's about how you desire. And what you desire. But we are also raising, the questions of why are there certain norms, so why is it assumed that only something that is pleasant is pleasurable? So we are actually, in a queer way, turning concepts upside down in our practice and in our community. So turning actually pain and pleasure equation on its head, or even challenging things like humiliation. Humiliation, of course we all fight for dignity, as activists we fight for our dignity as women, as Dalits, as LGBT, as kinky people also fight for our dignity. But if there is consent, if humiliation is what turns me on, then it is what turns me on. And that we will also fight for our right, for that to be respected as my desire. So we believe that as long as there is consent, and of course if one is an adult, then everything is okay, all desires are okay, all fantasies are okay, and who are we to judge ourselves and each other about our fantasies? Actually, our understanding in the BDSM community in India, and we have lawyers also who are part of the Kinky collective, is that BDSM is not illegal in India. So, because there is complete silence around it, so actually it is not illegal in that sense. But in terms of the struggle against 377, see, one is that it's not as if there are kinky people and there are LGBT people. There are many people in the community who are both kinky and LGBT and who are also activists, I mean like myself, who have been involved in the struggle against 377. And in terms of more visible kind of protests, I guess it's also by things like participation in queer pride that's happening. Not everybody who's from the BDSM community is comfortable to do that openly, but that is also happening, more and more. But I think that it's not so much about the law. And you see that, in fact, as somebody who is part of the LGBT community, I think it's also a problem how fixated we have become on the law. Although I myself and my friends and comrades have put in energies into, the legal battle, but there is also, we know, a problem there where then all our energies get taken up by the law. And in fact, younger LGBT people think that the queer movement actually began with the struggle against 377, whereas we know that the struggle has actually been a much older struggle, and the legal battle came in much later. And the legal battle was possible only because of the battle along the social and political lines. And I think also you mentioned, I think something about respectability or the LGBT community, and even I was saying how it's looked upon as being more respectable. So I think there the BDSM community has an advantage. Because I think as queer people, whether we are LGBT or not, or kinky, that we don't want to be respectable. We don't want respectability, and we do want to be deviant, and we do want to challenge ideas of what is natural and normal, because these ideas of what is natural and normal and these norms we know are basically there to prop up the existing power structures along existing power hierarchies of gender, caste, class, and religion, and private property and all the rest of it. And we don't want that. I'm not saying all kinky people, I'm saying kinky people who are also committed to a vision of justice, social justice, certainly don't want respectability. As somebody who has been part of the women's movement for over 30 years, as somebody who for a large part of those 30 years has fought against gender-based violence in different ways, whether it's campaigns or casework or trainings or whatever it is, that I will fight for the right for people to actually have any kind of fantasy that they want, including rape fantasies. And rape fantasies, actually, we know, and we've had discussions even within the women's movement, that we as feminists also have rape fantasies. So you cannot label fantasies as being right or wrong. Consent does not come into the picture. Consent kicks in only when you're trying to actualize that fantasy. And why actually the BDSM community promotes a culture that is against violence and against abuse is because we say that without consent you cannot do anything. No fantasy of yours can actually be actualized unless you don't seek consent in a proactive way. That consent can't be assumed. It has to be enthusiastic, proactive, explicit kind of consent, otherwise you cannot act upon that fantasy. So much better than the other scenario in which you have all kinds of fantasies which are either repressed or which then express themselves in whatever kind of way, get mixed up with unequal power relations, end up in violence, in abuse. And so I think the way to actually address even this issue of fantasies that involve non-consent is to bring consent into the picture at the level of actualized, when you actually want to play out your fantasies, but otherwise one can fantasize about anything. The object of your fantasy does not need to give you their consent. It's a really, really important thing to do. And as somebody who's been part of sexuality education, developing curricula and also conducting trainings and advocacy and research and all of that in my other life. But I think now it's really, really important to begin to talk about what is it that BDSM can offer us in terms of an understanding of sexuality. And I think because the fact is that we have all sorts of desires, we have all sorts of fantasies, and like what I was saying earlier, the important thing is consent, and that is very a critical part of the battle against abuse and violations. And in the BDSM community, we are the experts in consent. I mean, I say it with humility, but that is the case. We are experts in consent because that's what we know. That's at the heart of what we do. So we have mechanisms of actually negotiating consent. We don't restrict consent to harm reduction. We also see consent as how can it help us to fulfill our desires. So it's a positive framework. It's an empowering framework of consent. And I think mechanisms like the safe word are very, very important for everybody to learn, And now we've also been seeing, in recent times, extremely difficult cases that have come up in the legal realm, where even as feminists, there are differences of opinion. As activists, we don't really know what to make of this difficult territory of consent, because the fact is that even us, even people, even feminists, even as activists who've been around for a long time, even in our own lives, are we really equipped to negotiate consent, and maybe not, because there's no culture of talking about consent, and it's just imagined that there's passion and it's all sort of spontaneous, and there's also an assumption that to talk about consent is unsexy and it'll kill passion. And we in the BDSM community know that it can actually be very sexy to talk about consent, and even that process of negotiation can be an erotic thing to do. So we can actually talk about also how a community is so important, how support is so important to sustain that culture of consent, which is the opposite of rape culture. How can we build a kind of a community in which talking about consent and practicing consent is so important. And this thing of the safe word is actually something that everybody should be equipped with, whether it's younger people, older people, inside the BDSM community, outside the BDSM community, because it is in the power of withdrawal of consent that I feel consent really gets its power. Consent becomes meaningful and effective when I have the confidence that, as much time as it takes to snap my finger, I can actually withdraw that consent immediately, unconditionally, so then the kind of empowerment and the kind of confidence that gives you. It's also more in keeping with the reality of our erotic lives. Because our erotic lives do change, and we do explore our desires, and we do push our boundaries, we push each other's boundaries. So how do you do all that? And I don't believe one can keep checking at every point, okay, so is it okay if I do this? I mean, you can't ask that 10 times in the space of 1 hour, is it okay if I do this? Is it okay if I do that? Which is maybe what it seems like when you say, even the law says, no, you have to give consent, you have to be seen to be giving consent, or you have to verbally give consent. But how do we do that in practice? And maybe there is a real danger of killing passion if one's going to do it like every 10 minutes, asking, is it okay if I do this? And so I think that's why we do have a mechanism that at the beginning you do your talking, at the beginning you do your negotiation, you know, we have the language, we don't have to get technical about it, hard limits, soft limits, but basically all that means is that I can say that this you definitely cannot do, this I'm open to, you know, trying, and maybe other things we can explore, but the moment I feel I don't want you to do this, I will say it, or I will do a gesture and you have to stop. So that is in keeping with the reality of our sexual lives, which are changeful, you know, which change, and we must explore our desires. That's what sexual empowerment is about, you know, and we cannot be scared. We cannot be scared, even a man should not be scared that, you know, oh God, am I going to like violate her consent? You don't want that kind of inhibition, and there need not be that kind of inhibition as long as we have the practice and the mechanisms of consent. So to answer your question, yes, it has to become part of sexuality education curricula for young people. Yeah.